The knock came at dusk, when the last amber light of the Kansas sun was bleeding out across the plains like a wound that would not close, and Ida Merritt had already herded her 2 children down through the cellar hatch, with a finger pressed to her lips and terror coiled like a rattlesnake behind her ribs. She stood in the middle of the front room of the small homestead she had built with her own 2 hands over the last 18 months, hands that were rough with calluses and cracked at the knuckles from hauling water and splitting wood, and she listened to that knock with every nerve in her body pulled taut. The cabin was quiet. The iron pot on the stove had been shoved to the back burner. The lantern was turned down low. She had done everything right, everything she had rehearsed 100 times in her mind since the day she had learned that Hale Merritt had gotten out of the Dodge City jail 2 weeks early on account of a paperwork error that some incompetent deputy had made in the spring of 1882. She pressed herself flat against the wall beside the door and held her breath. The knock came again, 3 times, deliberate, not the frantic, furious pounding she had been dreading. Not the sound of a fist that wanted to break something. Just 3 even, careful knocks, the kind a person made when they were not entirely sure they were welcome but felt they had a reason to be there anyway. She reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall. It was loaded. She had checked it twice that morning. "Ma'am." The voice came through the thick pine boards of the door, low and measured, carrying the kind of quiet that took years to develop. "I know it is getting late and I apologize for calling at this hour. My name is Cornelius Archer. I ride for the Pendleton outfit up near Cimarron. My horse threw a shoe about 2 miles back, and I am going to lose her in the dark if I do not get her sorted. I saw your light and came to ask if you had a nail and a hammer I might borrow." Ida did not move. Her heart was slamming hard against the inside of her chest. "I mean no trouble," the voice said, and there was something in it that she could not immediately name, a kind of steadiness that was not practiced or performed. "I know a woman out here alone has every right to keep that door shut, and I will not argue with you if that is what you decide, but if you have a spare nail I would be grateful. I can pay." She shifted her grip on the shotgun. "How do I know who you are?" A pause. "Then, you do not, ma'am, and that is a fair problem to have. I can tell you that if you go around the west side of this property toward the creek bed, you will find my horse, a gray roan mare named Hattie, standing with her right front foot lifted off the ground. That is the truth of my situation. I'm not the kind of man who would come to a woman's door after dark with bad intentions. I know you have no reason to believe that, but I am telling you all the same." Ida looked at the door for a long moment. She thought of Dolly and little Samuel down in the cellar, crouched on the cold dirt floor with their knees pulled to their chests, not making a sound because she had taught them how to be silent, and they were good at it by now, which was a thing that broke her heart every single time she thought about it. Children who had learned to be invisible. That was not something a mother should have to be proud of. She thought about what it had cost her to come out here to this corner of Clark County in the first place. She thought about the bruises that had turned colors under her sleeves the winter before she left Dodge. She thought about the judge who had told her that a man had a right to discipline his household, and that she ought to think carefully before making accusations she could not prove in a court of law. She thought about packing a bag in the middle of the night with Dolly clinging to her back and Samuel bundled against her chest, walking 2 miles to the stage depot in the bitter February cold, and never once looking behind her. She thought about all of that, and then she looked at the door again, and she made a decision. She kept the shotgun up and cracked the door open 2 inches. The man standing on her porch was tall, though not the kind of tall that made a person feel crowded. He had the lean, weathered build of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, with a coat that had seen better days and a hat that had seen worse ones. His hands were visible and empty, held slightly out at his sides in a way that was clearly deliberate, clearly meant to show her exactly where his hands were. He had dark eyes and a jaw that needed a shave, and he looked at her through the crack in the door with an expression that was direct but not demanding. He did not look away from her to scan the interior of the cabin. He looked at her face. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing she noticed was that he was not Hale. She knew that was a foolish thing to have to tell herself. Hale was blond and thick-necked, and had a way of standing that always made the air around him feel smaller. This man was none of those things, but there was a part of her that had spent the last 2 weeks seeing Hale around every corner, in every long shadow, behind every unfamiliar sound, and she needed the evidence of her own eyes to confirm what her ears had already told her. "You said your name was Archer," she said through the crack. "Yes, ma'am." "Cornelius Archer, from just outside Pueblo originally. I have been working cattle drives since I was 19. I am 31 years old. I do not drink to excess, and I have never raised a hand to a woman or a child in my life." He said that last part plainly, not as a boast but as a statement of fact, and something about the directness of it went through her like a needle pulling thread. She opened the door a little wider, keeping the shotgun visible. He looked at it and nodded. "That is sensible," he said. "Wait there," she told him. She went to the back of the cabin where the small toolbox sat on the shelf above the dry sink, found a handful of horseshoe nails and came back. She held them out through the crack in the door. He took them carefully, making sure his fingers did not brush hers. "Thank you. I appreciate it more than I can say." He started to turn. "The hammer," she said, and surprised herself by saying it. She went back, retrieved the hammer, and held it out. "Bring it back when you are done. I need it." He turned back and looked at her with something that might have been surprise, quickly replaced by something quieter. "I will," he said. "You have my word." She watched him step off the porch and head around the side of the cabin in the direction of the creek, and she stood there in the doorway for a moment with the cool evening air coming in around her and the sound of the cicadas beginning in the grass, and she listened to his boots moving through the dry brush, steady and unhurried, until the sound faded. She went to the cellar hatch and lifted it. Dolly came up first, 8 years old and solemn-faced with her dark braids half undone, followed by Samuel, who was 5 and who immediately wrapped his arms around Ida's legs and pressed his face against her hip. She held them both and breathed them in and said, "It is all right." "It was just a man with a lame horse." "Did he go away?" Dolly asked. "He is fixing his horse. He will bring back my hammer and then he will go away." Dolly looked at the open front door. "What if it is Papa in disguise?" Ida crouched down to look at her daughter's face. Dolly had her eyes, pale gray and watchful, and she had her father's tendency to say the thing that cut right to the heart of a matter without any softening around the edges. "It is not your Papa," Ida said. "I would know." She made the children sit at the table and gave them each a piece of cornbread from the pan that had been keeping warm on the stove, and she stood in the doorway with the shotgun resting across her forearm and waited. He was back in less than half an hour. He came around the corner of the cabin with the hammer in his hand and his mare trailing behind him on a rope, and the horse walked flat-footed and easy now, her shoe back in place. He stopped a respectful distance from the porch and held out the hammer. Ida came down the 2 steps to take it. "She is good now," he said, meaning the horse. He stroked the mare's neck once with his free hand, absently, the way a person touched something they cared about without thinking about it. "I am grateful. What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Ida said, and then felt strange about it and added, "unless you have coffee." He blinked. "I am out," she said, and that was the truth. She had run out of coffee 3 days ago and had been drinking chicory in its place, which was fine but was not the same thing, and she had been meaning to ride the 12 miles to Ashland to buy some, but had not wanted to leave the homestead unattended, not with Hale potentially coming. "If you are riding through Ashland, I would pay you to bring some back. 2 pounds of ground coffee. I can give you the money now." He was quiet for a moment and she had the impression he was recalibrating something. Then he said, "I will be going through Ashland tomorrow morning. I would be glad to bring you coffee. You keep your money. Consider it a trade for the nails." "I gave you the nails. And I fixed my horse with them, which means I can keep riding, which means I can do my job, which means I get paid. The coffee is a fair exchange." She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the daylight was almost gone now, and the first stars were coming out above the flat, dark line of the plains, and he stood there in the gathering dark with his hat in his hand, looking at her without any of the things she had learned to be afraid of. "All right," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Archer." "Cornelius," he said, and then, as if catching himself, "Or whatever you prefer, ma'am." "Good night, Cornelius," she said, and went back inside. She latched the door and stood with her back against it and her eyes closed for a moment, listening to the sound of his horse moving away through the dark, and she was not sure what she felt exactly, but it was not the particular species of dread she had been carrying around for the last several months, and that alone was enough to notice. She did not sleep well that night, the way she rarely slept well anymore. She lay in the narrow bed she had pushed against the far wall and listened to the prairie sounds outside the walls of the cabin, the wind, the distant coyotes, the occasional creak of the timber settling. Dolly and Samuel slept in the other bed on the opposite side of the room, Dolly curled around her little brother the way she always did, and Ida lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the man at her door. There was no reason to think about him. He was a passing cowboy with a lame horse and a decent manner, and tomorrow he would drop 2 pounds of coffee on her porch probably, and ride on to wherever he was going, and that would be the entire sum of their acquaintance. That was the way things went out here. People passed through. Sometimes they were kind, sometimes they were not. You took what you needed and let the rest of it go. But she kept thinking about the way he had held his hands out to his sides, the way he had said, "I know a woman out here alone has every right to keep that door shut," the way he had looked at her face and not at the inside of her cabin. She fell asleep somewhere after midnight and dreamed of nothing at all, which was a mercy. He came back the next morning. She was in the yard hanging the washing when she heard the horse coming down the track, and she straightened and shaded her eyes against the early sun and watched him come. He rode the gray roan with the easy, unhurried posture of a man who spent a great deal of time in the saddle, and he had a cloth sack hanging from the saddle horn that clinked and shifted as the horse moved. Samuel had come outside to watch, and was standing in the doorway with his hand on the door frame, staring with the round-eyed fascination of a 5-year-old who had not seen many people in the last 18 months. Cornelius Archer pulled up in the yard and dismounted and untied the sack from the saddle and held it out. "Coffee," he said. 2 pounds. The man at the general store said it came in last week from Kansas City." He paused. "I also brought a tin of molasses because the storekeeper said it was good and I thought you might find a use for it. I put it on my own account. It is not a presumption, I hope." Ida took the sack and looked inside. There was the coffee, wrapped in brown paper, and a round tin of dark molasses with a paper label. She thought about refusing the molasses. Then she thought about the cornbread she had made last night without any sweetener because she was out of both molasses and honey, and how Samuel had eaten it anyway without complaint, and how that too was a thing that children should not have to learn to do. "Thank you," she said. "It is not a presumption." He nodded and started to remount. "Have you eaten?" she asked, and again surprised herself. He paused with one foot in the stirrup. "I had something on the road. I am making breakfast. It is not much, eggs and biscuits." He looked at her for a moment and then he put his foot back down. "I would not want to impose. You brought me coffee and molasses. Eat breakfast with us." He tied Hattie to the fence post and came inside, and he took off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door the way a person did when they knew how to behave indoors. And he sat at the table and looked around the cabin with the kind of careful, unhurried attention that was not nosiness but something more like appreciation. The cabin was small, but it was tidy and it was hers. She had chinked the walls herself and laid the stone of the hearth herself, and the shelves above the dry sink held her small collection of goods in careful order. Dolly came down from the loft where she had retreated when she heard the horse and stood at the bottom of the ladder looking at the man at the table with a measuring expression. "This is Dolly," Ida said, "and that is Samuel." Samuel had followed her inside and was now standing behind her leg, peering around her hip. Cornelius looked at both of them in turn. "Hello, Dolly. Hello, Samuel." His voice was the same as it had been the night before, quiet and even. He did not perform friendliness at them the way some adults did with children, overselling it, going loud and bright in a way that felt false. He just spoke to them the way he would speak to anyone. Dolly studied him. "Are you a cowboy?" she asked. "I am," he said. "Do you have a gun?" "Dolly," Ida said. "It is a reasonable question," Cornelius said. He looked at Dolly. "I do carry a revolver, yes. It is in my holster, which is hanging on the saddle outside. I do not bring guns into people's houses unless I am invited to." Dolly considered this. Then she climbed down the rest of the ladder and sat at the table across from him. Samuel came around from behind Ida's leg and went to look out the window at the horse. Ida put the coffee on to boil and cracked eggs into the iron pan and cut biscuit dough from the batch she had made that morning, and the cabin filled with the sounds and smells of a morning meal, and she was aware the whole time of the man sitting at her table, the way he sat quietly and did not try to fill the silence with talk, the way he watched her children with an expression that was gentle and contained, the way he folded his hands on the table and waited with the patience of someone who was genuinely comfortable in the absence of noise. "What is your horse's name?" Dolly asked. "Hattie," he said. "That is a person's name. She is something like a person. She has opinions." Dolly almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it was close, and Ida noticed it from the stove and felt something warm move through her chest. They ate together, the four of them, and the conversation moved slowly and carefully, the way conversations did between people who did not know each other but were cautiously interested in learning. He asked about the homestead, how long she had been here, how she managed the land. She answered honestly, telling him about the claim she had filed in the spring of 1881 under the Homestead Act, about the winter that had nearly broken her, about the garden that had done better this year than last. She did not tell him why she had come out here alone with two small children. He did not ask, but she saw, once or twice, the way his eyes moved to the latch on the inside of the door, the way they moved to the shotgun in the corner, the way they moved to her hands, which she knew bore the particular scars of too much hard work done too fast by someone who had not been doing it their whole life, someone who had come to it late and under duress. He was a perceptive man. She recognized that and did not know yet whether it frightened her or not. After breakfast, he helped her carry water from the creek, 2 trips without being asked, and she let him because the barrels needed filling and it was heavy work and her back had been aching since Tuesday. They walked side by side in the morning light without speaking much, and the silence was not the weighted, careful silence of two strangers managing tension, but something easier than that, something she did not quite have a name for yet. At the gate he stopped and put the bucket down and said, "I am going to say something and I hope you will hear it in the spirit it is intended." She waited. "I have been riding through this part of the country for 2 years now, back and forth on drive routes, and I have stopped at homesteads like this one more times than I can count. I know what a place looks like when a woman is living carefully." He looked at the ground for a moment and then back at her. "I am not asking you to explain anything to me. I do not need to know your story, but if there is trouble coming your way, you do not have to face it alone. I am going to be camping about 3 miles south of here tonight, at the bend in the creek, while I wait for the rest of the Pendleton outfit to come through. If you need anything, you fire that shotgun twice and I will hear it." Ida looked at him for a long moment. The morning sun was behind him and it rimmed his edges with gold, and she thought that he was a genuinely good-looking man, though that was not the point, and she pushed the thought aside. The point was what he had just said and the quiet, uncomplicated certainty with which he had said it. "Why?" she asked. He picked up the bucket again. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said simply, as if that were the whole and entire answer, which she supposed it was. She did not fire the shotgun that night, but she slept better than she had in weeks. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that she had not anticipated. Cornelius did not impose himself. He came once in the morning to check that everything was all right, stayed long enough to have coffee and exchange a few words, and then went about his own business. He was waiting for the rest of the Pendleton outfit, which was delayed by a river crossing that had gone badly 2 counties over, and so he was camped nearby for longer than either of them had expected. On the 3rd day, Samuel summoned the courage to ask if he could see the horse. Cornelius brought Hattie to the fence and lifted Samuel up so he could put his small hand on the mare's neck, and Samuel's eyes went very wide and very bright, and Ida stood on the porch watching the two of them, man and boy, the boy's hand on the horse's warm gray hide, and she felt the thing she had been trying not to feel for 3 days, which was that this man was kind in the particular way that mattered, the way that did not perform itself, the way that simply was. On the 4th day, Dolly asked him if he would teach her to throw a rope, and he said he would if her mother had no objection, and Ida said she had no objection, and spent the better part of an hour watching her daughter learn to loop a coil of rope and swing it over her head with a focused, determined expression, while Cornelius stood behind her with his arms out in patient demonstration. On the 5th day, he asked her if she would like to walk with him to the ridge to the west, where he said there was a view worth seeing, and she said she would, and they left the children with their afternoon chores and walked a mile through the tall grass in the afternoon light. And at the top of the ridge, the whole of the plains spread out below them in every direction, green and gold and enormous. And Ida stood there looking at it with the wind moving her hair and felt for the first time in a very long time that the world was actually large, that there was actual space in it, that she was not trapped. "It is something, is it not?" he said quietly beside her. "It is," she said. "I forget sometimes. When I am working, I forget that it is like this." "I never do," he said. "It is one of the reasons I cannot stay in one place for very long. I want to see what is on the other side." "And what is on the other side?" He smiled, which was the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face completely, opened it up in a way that was almost startling. More of this, mostly, but different. They stood there for a while, side by side, not touching, the wind coming through the grass below them in long silver waves, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her and waited. She told him about Hale. She told him the way she had not told anyone, not the full truth, because there had not been anyone she trusted enough to tell it to. She told him about the marriage in 1874 in Dodge City when she was 20 years old and Hale Merritt was 26 and charming and handsome and full of plans that never quite materialized. She told him about the first year that was genuinely fine, almost good, and the second year when the drinking got worse, and the third year when the promises he broke started to include promises about not putting his hands on her. She told him about the years that followed, 7 of them, each one its own education in the particular geometry of surviving a man who could be loving and devastating in the same afternoon. She told him about the judge. She told him about the February night when she had finally left. She told him about the letter she had received 3 weeks ago from a woman named Martha Hendricks in Dodge City, who was a friend, and who had written to say that Hale had gotten out of jail and had been asking around town about where she had gone, and that he had told at least 2 people he was going to find her and bring her back. She told him all of it standing on that ridge with the plain spread out below her, and she watched his face while she told it, and his face did not show her pity or skepticism, or the particular discomfort that men sometimes showed when a woman told them about another man's violence, as if the telling of it implicated them somehow. His face showed something harder and quieter than any of those things. Something that looked like contained, focused anger, not at her but on her behalf, which was a thing she had not experienced before and did not entirely know how to absorb. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Has there been any sign of him?" "Not yet." "The letter was 3 weeks ago." "Yes." "Does anyone else know where you are? Anyone who might tell him?" "I do not think so. I filed my claim under my maiden name, Ida Byrne." She paused. "I went back to Byrne as soon as I left. I thought it would be harder for him to find me." He nodded slowly. "That was smart. It has been smart enough so far." He looked at the planes for a moment, then he said, "I am not leaving." She looked at him. "The outfit can wait another week. I will send word to Pendleton that I am delayed." He held up a hand when she started to speak. "It is not charity and it is not pity. I understand if you want to send me down that ridge and tell me to mind my own affairs. You have every right to do that and I will not argue with you, but I am asking you to let me stay nearby until this resolves itself one way or another. That is all." "You do not have to," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said. "That is rather the point." She looked at him for a long time. The sun was lower now and it was hitting the grass at a low angle that turned everything amber and soft, and he stood there in that light looking at her steadily. And she thought about what it had cost her to trust anyone, what it had cost her to rely on anyone, and she thought about the 2 children down in the cabin below the ridge, and she thought about what she needed. "All right," she said. "You can stay." They walked back down the ridge together as the sun finished going down. On the 6th morning, she got up before dawn and could not get back to sleep, and so she made coffee and sat on the porch in the gray pre-dawn dark, wrapped in a shawl, listening to the prairie wake up. And Cornelius rode in about an hour after first light and swung down from Hattie and came to sit on the porch steps without being invited to, which she did not mind, and she handed him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one, which she noticed him noticing. They sat in the early light and drank their coffee, and the silence between them was easy, was almost domestic, and she was aware of that word forming in her mind and was not entirely sure what to do with it. She was 30 years old. She had been through something that had used up a good deal of her capacity for innocent hoping. She was not the kind of woman who let herself be swept away by the proximity of a decent man just because decent men had been scarce in her experience. But she was also honest enough with herself to notice that she looked forward to him coming every morning, that she noticed when she was cooking whether there would be enough for a 4th person at the table, that she had begun listening for the sound of his horse the way she listened for weather coming in from the northwest. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. "Have you ever been married?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was, yes, a long time ago. Her name was Clara. We were married in 1873. She died of fever in the summer of 1876. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "We did not have any children. I used to think that was a mercy, given what happened. Now I am not sure." "I am sorry," she said, and meant it completely. "It was a long time ago," he said, which was the thing people said, but he said it without defensiveness, without the quality of wanting to close the subject. He just said it honestly. "Do you get lonely?" she asked, and then felt the forwardness of the question and said, "You do not have to answer that." "I do get lonely," he said. "I have gotten used to it mostly." There is a difference between being used to something and being all right with it. He paused. "What about you?" She thought about it. "I was lonely inside my marriage," she said. "That is a particular kind of lonely that I do not recommend. Out here the lonely is cleaner. It is just the quiet and the sky and the work, and I know the reasons for it and they are my own reasons." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she met his eyes and felt the full weight of his attention for the first time, the fact of it, how much of him was actually present in his gaze, and it did something to the air in her chest that she was not sure she was ready for. "It does not have to be permanent," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It does not." They left it there, hanging in the cool morning air between them, and finished their coffee, and the sun came the rest of the way up over the eastern plains, and Dolly came out to feed the chickens, and Samuel came out to stand on the porch steps and inform Cornelius that he had decided the horse's name should be changed to Thunder. And Cornelius said that was a fine suggestion, but that Hattie had had her name for 12 years and would probably not answer to anything else at this point. And Samuel thought about this and said, "What if we just called her Hattie Thunder?" And Cornelius looked at Ida with an expression that was pure amusement, and she laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and the sound of it surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. It was on the 9th day that Ida Merritt came. She had been in the garden, which was on the north side of the cabin, when she heard the horse on the road. She looked up and her whole body knew before her mind did. The horse was a chestnut, and the man riding it was blond and thick-shouldered, and he rode the way he had always ridden, like someone who was owed the road and everything on either side of it. She did not run. She had made herself a promise after she left that she would never run from him again, not where he could see her do it. She walked quickly around the side of the cabin and came through the back door and said, in the calm, carrying voice she had practiced, "Dolly, Samuel, Cellar." Now, Dolly was at the table. She looked at her mother's face and asked no questions. She took her brother's hand and went to the hatch in the floor, and they went down. And Ida lowered the hatch and put the braided rug over it, and then took the shotgun off the wall and went to stand in the middle of the room. The horse came into the yard. She heard Hale swing down, and his boots hit the ground the way they always did, heavier than his weight would suggest, as if he were trying to make an impression on the earth itself. The knock on the door was not 3 quiet knocks. It was a single hard blow with the side of his fist. "Ida," he said, "I know you are in there. I know this is your claim. I found the filing in the land office in Ashland." A pause. "Open the door. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to talk." Ida stood very still. Every part of her was calm on the surface and a controlled, white-hot fury underneath. She thought of the 9 years she had spent in that house in Dodge City. She thought of the judge's office. She thought of the February night. She thought of her children on the cold dirt floor of the cellar, and she aimed the shotgun at the door. "I'm not opening the door, Hale," she said, and her voice was flat and even. "You need to get back on that horse and ride away from here." A pause. "Ida, come on now." His voice shifted to the conciliatory register she knew well, the one that preceded either genuine apologies or worse. "I have changed. I have had time to think. I want to see my children." "Your children are not here. I do not believe that. I do not care what you believe. You need to leave." She heard him try the door handle. She heard him find it latched. "I'm a patient man," he said, and the conciliatory note was gone now, replaced by the flat, level thing underneath it. "You know that about me, Ida. I will stand out here all day and all night if I need to." She heard a second set of hoofbeats before he finished the sentence. She heard the horse come to a stop in the yard. She heard Cornelius say, in the same quiet, measured voice he used for everything, "I think you have said your piece." A silence. Then Hale said, "Who are you?" "My name does not matter. What matters is that you have been asked to leave, and I am asking you again. This is between me and my wife." "She is not your wife any longer, from what I understand," Cornelius said. "And she has asked you to go. You will go." Ida moved to the window. Through the cracked shutter she could see Cornelius sitting his horse 10 feet from Hale, easy in the saddle, his hands on the reins. His revolver was at his hip. He had not drawn it. He did not need to yet. There was something in his posture that communicated clearly that he knew how to use it and would if necessary, and that communication was doing the work on its own. Hale was looking up at him with the expression she knew, the calculating one, the one he wore when he was measuring his odds. "You are trespassing on a man's property," Hale said. "The property belongs to the woman inside that house," Cornelius said. "She filed the claim and she built the house, and you were not here for any of it. Now she is asking you to go, and I am asking you to go, and if you do not go I will be riding to the county sheriff's office in Ashland to report that a man with a prior conviction for assault is harassing a woman who holds a legal land claim." He paused. "That will go badly for you. You know it will." Another silence. Ida watched Hale's hands. She had always watched his hands. They had told her more over the years than his face or his voice had ever told her. His hands were still. "I want to see my children," Hale said, but the steel was going out of his voice, and she recognized that too. She recognized the sound of a man deciding that the calculation had come out wrong. "You can file a petition with the county court if you want to pursue that," Cornelius said. "That is the legal avenue. This is not the legal avenue. A very long silence. Then she heard Hale's boots on the ground again, moving toward his horse. She heard the leather creak as he mounted. She watched through the shutter as he turned the chestnut and looked at the cabin one last time, and she looked back at him through the narrow gap in the shutter, and she felt the years between them like a physical thing, like something she was, finally, actually putting down. He rode away. Cornelius sat his horse in the yard and watched him go until the sound of the chestnut's hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Then he swung down and tied Hattie to the fence post and came to stand at the door. "He is gone," he said. She unlatched the door and opened it and stood there with the shotgun still in her hands, and she felt the shaking start, the way it always started after, when the immediate crisis was over and the body finally caught up to what had happened. She had felt it the night she left Dodge City, standing in the stage depot with her children pressed against her. She felt it now. He looked at her and then he stepped up onto the porch and very carefully, very deliberately, he took the shotgun from her hands and set it against the wall, and then he put his hands on her shoulders, not pulling her in, just holding, just steady, and said, "You held up. You did exactly right." She pressed her hands to her face. She did not cry, or not very much, just 2 or 3 sharp breaths that were something between a sob and a sigh, and then she put her hands down and looked at him. His hands were still on her shoulders, warm and solid. "I was so angry," she said. "All I felt was angry." "That is the right response," he said. "I thought I would be more afraid." "You had your shotgun and you knew what you were doing. Fear and courage are not different things, they are the same thing." She looked at him for a long moment, with his hands on her shoulders and the afternoon sun falling across the porch between them. "I have to get my children," she said. "Yes," he said, and released her. She went inside and lifted the cellar hatch, and Dolly came up first and looked at her mother's face with those gray, watchful eyes, and Ida said, "He is gone." Dolly stood very still for a moment, and then she put her arms around Ida's waist and held on, and Ida held her back, and Samuel came up behind and added himself to the embrace, and the 3 of them stood there in the middle of the cabin floor and held each other. Cornelius sat on the porch steps and waited. When Ida came out after a little while, the children with her, he looked up at them and then at her. Samuel went directly to the porch railing and leaned over to look at Hattie in the yard. Dolly sat down on the step beside Cornelius and did not say anything, but she sat close to him, and he did not make anything of it. "I have to go to Ashland," Ida said. "I need to speak to the sheriff. I need this recorded, what happened today, in case he comes back." "I will ride with you," Cornelius said. "I can go alone." "I know you can. I would like to go with you." She looked at him. "You keep saying that. I know you can, and then I would like to go with you anyway." "I am consistent," he said. She almost smiled, and then she did smile, small and tired and real. They rode to Ashland the next morning, the 4 of them, Dolly and Samuel sharing the back of Cornelius's roan because the wagon made better time than Ida's sway-backed mare. And Ida rode alongside them, and they went in under the clear Kansas sky, with the dust rising from the road in small white clouds around the horses' feet. The sheriff in Ashland was a man named Braddock, weathered and direct, who listened to Ida's account without interrupting and wrote it down in his ledger with a blunt pencil, asking questions only when he needed to clarify something. He already knew Hale Merritt's name, which told Ida something. Men like Hale tended to leave a record wherever they went. "He has no legal claim on this property," Braddock said when she was done. "You hold the title, and if he has a prior assault conviction in Ford County, we can file a complaint with the circuit judge if he comes back. That would get him removed from this part of the territory entirely." He looked at her steadily. "It would take a few weeks. There would be paperwork." "I can wait for paperwork," Ida said. She filed the complaint that afternoon. It took an hour and left her fingers cramped from signing her name in all the places the clerk indicated. But when she walked out of the county courthouse into the late afternoon sun, she felt something shift in the weight she had been carrying. It was still there, but it was different. It was a weight she had chosen to address through legitimate channels, which was different from a weight she was simply enduring. Cornelius was waiting on the boardwalk with the children, who had eaten crackers and some kind of hard candy that he had bought them from the general store, and who were in better humor than they had been all day. "Well," he said. "It is filed," she said. He nodded. "Good." They ate supper at the small restaurant on the main street of Ashland before riding back, a simple meal of beef stew and bread, and they sat at a table by the window in the last of the daylight. And Dolly ate with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and Samuel fell asleep in his chair before the bread arrived, and Cornelius moved the boy so his head was resting on his folded coat on the bench beside him, doing it gently and without ceremony. And Ida watched him do it and felt the thing she had been feeling for 11 days settle into something definite and clear. She was in love with him, or she was becoming in love with him, which was the more honest way to put it. It was not the young, heedless, falling kind of love she had felt for Hale at 20, the kind that had been mostly about the force of someone's attention and the novelty of being chosen. This was something quieter and more precise. This was about the way he moved through the world, the way he treated her children, the way he said what he meant and meant what he said, the way he had stood in her yard and told her husband to leave with no particular drama and no performance of heroism, just the plain, quiet force of someone who had decided what the right thing was and was doing it. She was 30 years old, and she had been through a marriage that had taken a great deal from her, and she was not certain she was ready, and she was also aware that readiness was perhaps not the relevant variable. On the ride home, Samuel woke up and rode in front of Cornelius on the saddle, leaning back against his chest, and went asleep again within 10 minutes, and Cornelius rode with one arm lightly across the sleeping child to keep him steady, and Ida rode beside them in the dark with the stars enormous above them and said nothing, and the silence was full and warm and held them all in it. At the gate of the homestead he handed Samuel down to her, and she put the boy to bed, and when she came back out onto the porch Cornelius was still there, leaning against the fence post with his arms folded, looking at the stars. "You should stay," she said, not romantically, just factually. "The spare room, it is not much, just a cot, but it is better than the ground." He looked at her. "In case he comes back," she said. "All right," he said. "Yes, thank you." He slept on the cot that night, and she lay in her bed and listened to the quiet, ordinary sounds of another person in her house, the creak of the cot, the sound of breathing, the occasional shift of a boot on the floor, and she thought that she had forgotten what that was like, the simple fact of not being alone in the dark, and she fell asleep faster than she had in years. The nights that followed settled into a routine. He slept on the cot. He helped with the morning work before riding out to tend to his own affairs. He came back for supper. He sat on the porch in the evenings while the children did their lessons, helping Dolly with the arithmetic problem she had taken to bringing to him because, as she informed Ida, he explains it differently and it makes more sense. Ida had not known before this that Cornelius had a thorough education, that he had grown up in a family that believed in schooling, that he had read widely, that he had opinions about literature and mathematics, and the shape of the frontier, and the particular injustice of the homestead policies that gave families land without giving them enough support to keep it through the hard years. She found out these things in the evenings on the porch, in the conversations that deepened gradually over the days, and she told him her own things in return, the things she had never told anyone because there had been no one who had the patience and the interest to listen. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about her father who was a school teacher and her mother who was quietly fierce and had wanted her daughter to be educated and was disappointed in ways she never said aloud when Ida married at 20 and moved west. She told him about the part of herself that had survived the years with Hale intact, the part that had run the household and kept the accounts and quietly gotten herself and her children out, the part that had filed a land claim and built a cabin and kept a garden and raised 2 children on her own in the middle of a Kansas winter. "You are the most capable person I have ever met," he said one evening, and he said it the way he said most things, without decoration. "That is an overstatement," she said. "I do not overstate things," he said. "You know that about me by now." She did know that about him by now. She also knew the particular quality of his attention when he was listening, the way he went completely still, the way his eyes stayed on her face. She knew that he liked his coffee black and strong, and that he had a slight preference for morning over evening, that he attributed to some vague philosophical conviction about beginnings. She knew that he was patient to a fault with animals and children, and considerably less patient with bureaucracy and foolishness. She knew that he had a small scar on his left hand from a branding accident when he was 23. She knew these things the way you knew them about someone you had been paying close attention to, someone you were interested in knowing. It was 3 weeks after Hale's visit when Cornelius got the message from the Pendleton outfit that they were riding through and needed him in 2 days. He told her in the morning over coffee, and she listened without the reaction she could feel building inside her, which was a reaction she had no right to, which was that she did not want him to go. "When will you come back through?" she asked. He looked at his coffee. "The Pendleton job will take us to late October. Then I am free until spring." He paused. "I would like to come back." "To check on us," she said. "To see you," he said. "All of you. But yes, I want to know you are all right. I want to know the situation with Hale is resolved." He looked up at her. "I want to come back because I want to see you. That is the plain truth of it." She held his gaze. The morning light was coming in through the window and it lay across the table between them, warm and specific, and she felt the thing she had been holding carefully and at a slight distance for weeks now come a little closer. "I want you to come back," she said. His jaw shifted slightly. She could see the effort of staying measured. "Then I will come back," he said, "the day after the Pendleton job is done." He told the children that afternoon. Samuel received the news with the philosophical equanimity of a 5-year-old who had not yet fully grasped the concept of time and was therefore not especially troubled by the idea of months. Dolly went very quiet and then went upstairs to the loft, and when Cornelius came to the base of the ladder and asked if she was all right, there was a long pause, and then her voice came down. "Will you actually come back?" He put his hand on the ladder rung. "Yes," he said, "I will. I give you my word, and I do not give my word lightly." Another pause. "Papa said he would do things too." A silence. "I am not your papa," Cornelius said. "And I am not making you a promise because it is what you want to hear. I am making it because it is true." A very long pause. Then Dolly came back down the ladder and stood in front of him and studied him with those steady gray eyes, and then she said, "All right," and went to help with supper. He left the next morning. He said goodbye to the children first, and then he said goodbye to Ida in the yard by the gate, and she stood with her arms around herself in the early morning cool, and he looked at her with everything he was not quite yet saying visible in his expression. "October," he said. "October," she said. He mounted and turned Hattie south and rode away, and she watched him go until he was a small dark shape against the pale morning sky, and then she went back inside and made herself busy. The weeks that followed were long in the way weeks could be when you were waiting for something, when the ordinary texture of the days was underlaid by a persistent awareness of absence. She had not been waiting for anything in a very long time. She had been surviving, which was a different and more exhausting occupation, and now that she was not solely in survival mode, she found that the waiting had its own particular quality, not entirely unpleasant, sometimes sweetly acute. She did not let herself dwell on it too much. She had the garden to close down for the fall, the root vegetables to harvest and store, the cabin to weatherproof before the cold came. She rode to Ashland twice, once for supplies, and once when she got word from Sheriff Braddock that the circuit judge had ruled on her complaint and issued a formal order requiring Ida Merritt to stay out of Clark County or face arrest. She read that document 3 times standing in the sheriff's office and felt the last of the fear loosen its grip on her ribs. Hale was gone, legally and formally, and, she believed, finally. He was not a man who challenged official authority when the odds were against him. He was a man who picked his battles, and he had looked at Cornelius in her yard and done the calculation and left, and now the law had confirmed the calculation. She believed she would not see him again. The relief of that belief was so large that she stood in the sheriff's office and breathed it in for a solid minute before she said thank you and walked out into the October sunshine. She told the children that evening. Dolly sat very still for a moment and then went outside and stood in the yard for a while, alone, and Ida let her be. Samuel asked if it meant they did not have to go in the cellar anymore, and Ida said yes, and Samuel cheered and ran in a circle, which made her laugh. Cornelius came back on the 23rd of October. She heard Hattie before she saw them, heard that particular rhythm in the hoofbeats that she had learned over the weeks, and came out onto the porch. And there he was, riding up the track with the morning sun at his back, and his coat collar turned up against the autumn chill. And she stood on the porch and looked at him coming and felt the whole of the last 2 months collapse into this moment. He rode into the yard and swung down and looked at her, and there was a beat of pure and mutual recognition between them. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "Cornelius Archer." She said his name the way she had said it to herself sometimes in the evenings on the porch, and it came out different than she intended, softer, more particular. He came up the porch steps and stood in front of her, and neither of them moved for a moment. "Ida," he said, just her name, in the voice he used for things he actually meant. She reached up and put her hand on his jaw, the side of his face that still had the morning cold in it, and felt the scratch of the few days' growth there. He turned his face slightly into her hand, a small motion barely perceptible, but it went through her completely. "I missed you," she said, and it came out plain and honest. "Lord," he said quietly. "I missed you too, every day." She was not sure which of them moved first. It might have been both at the same time, the way those things sometimes worked, both people leaning toward the same point simultaneously. And then he was kissing her, careful and warm and deliberate, one hand coming up to cup the back of her head, and she kissed him back with every one of the 2 months she had been waiting. And the porch creaked under their feet, and somewhere in the back of the cabin she heard Dolly's voice saying something to Samuel, ordinary household noise. And the ordinariness of it was part of what made the moment feel so extraordinary. When they separated, he looked at her with the same steady, open expression he always had, but warmer now, fundamentally altered. "I have something to ask you," he said. "It is not something you need to answer right away. I want you to know that." "Ask me," she said. He took a breath. "I am 31 years old and I have been a drifting man for a long time, and I have not wanted to be anything else until about 6 weeks ago, and I do not want to pressure you or rush you. You have been through something that I understand has affected how you trust, and I would never take that lightly." He paused and looked at her steadily. "But I am asking whether there is a possibility, somewhere down the road, that you might be willing to consider a life with me, not as a passing arrangement, as a permanent one." The morning light lay across the yard, and the dry autumn grass moved in the light wind, and the plain stretched out in every direction, enormous and clear. And Ida looked at this man on her porch, this steady, patient, honest man, and thought about what she had come out here for, what she had survived for, what she had built. "Ask me at Christmas," she said. He blinked. "Not because I do not know the answer," she said, "but because I want you to be sure, and I want both of us to have more time, and because I want you to spend Christmas here with us and know what you are asking for." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something came into his expression that she could only call joy, quiet and deep and real. "Christmas it is," he said. He stayed. He did not go back on another drive. He wrote to the Pendleton outfit and told them he would not be available in the spring, and he helped Ida close down the garden properly and weatherproof the cabin and lay in enough firewood to last the winter. And they worked side by side through the gray October afternoons. And it was good work, good and real, the kind that left you satisfied at the end of the day. In November, Dolly decided formally and without ceremony that she liked him, which she communicated by beginning to tell him things about her day the way she told Ida, the small detailed reports that were her way of including a person in her life. Cornelius received these reports with full seriousness and asked follow-up questions and did not treat any of them as small, and Ida watched this happen from across the room and felt something so full and warm in her chest that she had to look away sometimes to keep it from showing on her face, though she was not sure who she was hiding it from. Samuel had by this point decided that Cornelius was simply part of the household, the way the stove was part of the household, and the porch steps were part of the household, a fixture that was simply present and reliable. He had stopped registering his arrival as an event and started registering his absence as a slight irregularity, the kind of irregularity that made him come to find Ida and say, "Where is Cornelius?" and accept the answer and go back to whatever he had been doing. In December, the first snow came, a thin early snow that dusted the plains and the roof of the cabin and sat in the folds of the dry grass, and they were all inside around the stove when it started, Dolly with her arithmetic and Samuel with the set of small wooden blocks that Cornelius had carved for him over the course of 2 evenings in November. It was warm inside, and it smelled of wood smoke and the beef stew that was in the pot, and the snow fell past the window in slow, soundless curtains, and Ida sat across the table from Cornelius with her mending in her lap and watched the snow fall and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was happy. She was actually happy. Not the defiant, willful happiness she had sometimes manufactured for the sake of her children during the hard times. Real, unforced happiness, the kind that simply was, that did not require maintenance. She looked at Cornelius. He was reading a worn copy of a book he had produced from his saddlebag that she had eventually identified as a collection of geography essays, which she thought was a remarkably Cornelius Archer thing to carry in a saddlebag. He felt her looking and glanced up, and she did not look away, and he did not either. "Ask me now," she said. He put the book down. "Christmas is 2 weeks away," he said. "I know, ask me now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Ida, will you marry me?" She set down the mending. "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across the table and took her hand. Dolly looked up from her arithmetic. She looked at their joined hands on the table, and then at each of their faces in turn, and she said, in the even, deliberate way she said most things, "Good," and went back to her arithmetic. Samuel was not paying attention and went on building his tower of blocks. Ida and Cornelius looked at each other across the table with the snow falling past the window and the stove ticking quietly and Dolly doing her sums and Samuel building his tower, and they were both smiling, full and unguarded. They married in Ashland in February of 1883, in the small church on the main street, with Sheriff Braddock and his wife as witnesses, and the preacher who was only in town twice a month, and who was therefore somewhat harried but entirely willing. Ida wore her good blue dress and had her hair pinned up in the way she only did for important occasions, and Cornelius wore his cleanest coat and a shirt that was, she noted, pressed, which told her something about how much the occasion meant to him. Dolly stood beside her mother and Samuel stood beside Cornelius, having been assigned the role of attendant in whatever way a 5-year-old could serve as attendant, which was mostly to stand in the right place and not run anywhere. They said their vows in the winter light coming through the plain glass windows of the church, and Ida's voice was steady and sure, and Cornelius's was steady and quiet, and when the preacher said he could kiss his bride he did, gently and properly, and Samuel said loudly, "Can we eat now?" And the small gathering laughed. They ate at the restaurant on Main Street afterward, a proper celebration meal, and Sheriff Braddock made a brief toast that was mostly a recitation of facts, which suited all of them, and his wife cried a little, which Ida thought was sweet. On the way home in the wagon, Cornelius drove with Samuel asleep against his side, and Dolly sitting behind them on the wagon bed with her legs hanging over the edge, watching the road go by, and Ida sat close to her husband in the cold afternoon air, and held his arm and looked at the country she had claimed as hers. The flat, enormous, sky-filled country that had been her refuge and was now something more than that, was home. Spring came and they planted the garden together, a larger garden than Ida had managed alone, and Cornelius turned out to have strong opinions about row spacing and fertilization that were based on actual knowledge rather than mere preference, which she found both amusing and useful. He had taken on work with a local rancher named Garfield who ran cattle on the land 3 miles to the east, and so he had steady income and was home every evening, and the rhythm of the days was full and real and good. In April, Dolly turned 9, and Cornelius carved her a wooden box with a latch that actually worked, and put a small mirror inside it that he had found in the Ashland General Store, and Dolly received it with an expression of such carefully controlled delight that Ida had to go to the other side of the yard to compose herself. In May, Ida began to suspect, and by June she was certain. She told Cornelius on a warm evening when they were sitting on the porch together after the children were asleep, and she watched his face change when she told him, watched the thing come into his expression that was bigger than his usual careful composure, something full and bright and undisguised. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes, I am about 3 months along, I think." He looked at her for a long moment and then he said very quietly, "I have wanted this. For a very long time." He paused. "I did not let myself know that until I met you." She reached over and took his hand and he held it firmly, warmly, and they sat together in the summer evening with the Kansas sky going dark above them, enormous and starred, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "What do you want?" she asked. "Boy or girl?" "Both," he said. "Eventually," she laughed. "Let us start with one." "A boy," he said after a moment. "First." "A boy who will learn things and do something good with them." He paused. "Or a girl, I will not pretend to be particular. You just said boy." "I said boy, I meant either." "That is not how that works, Cornelius." "No," he admitted. "It is not." He tightened his hand around hers. "Healthy, that is what I want. The rest of it is details." The summer was full and warm and steady. Cornelius rode out to the Garfield ranch 5 days a week and came home every evening. Ida worked the garden and managed the household and taught Dolly her lessons, and kept Samuel from eating dirt, which remained a periodic concern. She wrote to her mother in Ohio, a long letter, the first honest letter she had written in years, telling her where she was and what her life looked like now, and her mother wrote back within 3 weeks, a letter that was 12 pages long and that cried on the page in a few places in a way that Ida recognized, and that made her cry too, a good kind of crying, the kind that cleared something. Samuel turned 6 in August and was given a small project of his own in the garden, a row of beans that was his responsibility from planting to harvest, and he took this responsibility with a seriousness that was absolutely characteristic of him. He had Cornelius's patience, Ida thought sometimes, observing him crouching at the end of his row pulling weeds with focused deliberation. Not literally, obviously, but there was something in the way he applied himself to things that reminded her of the man who had come to her door on a spring evening with a lame horse and an honest face. She thought about that evening sometimes. The 3 knocks, the voice through the door, the way he had held his hands out to show her they were empty. She thought about how close she had come to not opening the door at all, to waiting it out until whoever was on the other side went away. She thought about how easily that could have happened, how differently everything could have gone. She thought about the fact that she had opened the door and what that had taken and what it had given her. In September, Cornelius built an addition onto the back of the cabin, a proper second room with a window that faced east to catch the morning light, and he built it with care, every log fitting the way it ought to, every joint tight against the coming winter. Dolly helped hand him nails, which she had appointed herself to do without being asked, and Samuel supervised from the garden with his bean project, offering occasional remarks. By October the room was done and it was good and solid, and Ida stood in it in the afternoon light and looked at the east-facing window and thought about the child who would sleep here, in the spring, when everything was new again. The baby came in late January of 1884, on a night of hard snow that had been threatening for 2 days. It was a difficult birth, harder than either of the first two had been, and the midwife who had ridden out from Ashland in the cold said afterward that Ida was the most composed woman she had ever attended to, which Ida took as a compliment, though she did not entirely feel composed. She felt very much as if she were moving through something enormous and physical and real, which she supposed was accurate. It was a boy. They named him Edmund, which was Cornelius's father's name, and he was red-faced and emphatic, and had a set of opinions about existing that he communicated at high volume from the first minutes, which made Cornelius laugh in the way he rarely laughed, full and completely unguarded, the first time she heard that particular laugh in the whole of knowing him. Dolly came in to see the baby with the careful, solemn expression she brought to important events, and she looked at Edmund for a long time, and then she said, "He looks like a potato," and Ida laughed so hard that the midwife looked alarmed. Samuel, upon being shown his new brother, said, "Can he have some of my beans?" "Not yet," Cornelius said, "but maybe in a year or so." "I will save some," Samuel said with perfect seriousness. The winter closed in around them and they were warm inside it. Edmund grew and changed the way babies did, imperceptibly on any given day and startlingly over a week, and Cornelius held him in the evenings with the ease of a man who was not afraid of small things and who had been waiting for this particular small thing for a long time, longer than he had known. Ida watched him with the baby and felt the same thing she had felt on the ridge the first time she had looked out at the plains with him beside her, which was the sense of actual largeness, the sense of space and possibility, the sense that the world was bigger than the dimensions she had been allowed to believe. She thought sometimes about the years with Hale. She thought about them less and less as time went on, but she did not pretend they had not happened, and she did not pretend that they had not shaped her. They had shaped her. They had shaped Dolly, who was still watchful and still careful, and who was also, slowly and in her own time, becoming something that relaxed. They had shaped Samuel, who mostly did not remember them but who had the particular steadiness of a child, who had learned early that quiet was sometimes survival, and had now learned that it did not have to be. She thought about the fact that she had built something out of the rubble of all of that, and that the building was a real thing, a permanent thing, and that she had done it herself before Cornelius came, and had done it differently, more fully after. She thought about Cornelius coming to her door in the last light of that spring evening, with his hat in his hand and his horse standing lame down by the creek, and asking in that even, measured voice if she had a nail and a hammer. The simplest request in the world. The most ordinary possible beginning. She thought about how he had said, standing in the lamplight on her porch, "I am not the man she was hiding from." Not in those words, not literally, but in every other way that mattered. In the spring of 1884, when Edmund was 3 months old, a letter came from Ida's mother in Ohio, asking if she might come to visit, and Ida wrote back immediately and said yes. Her mother arrived in June on the stage to Ashland, thinner than Ida remembered and somewhat more bent by the years, but with the same sharp eyes and the same brisk, contained manner that Ida had spent her whole childhood trying to live up to, and they embraced on the main street of Ashland for a long moment, and then her mother stepped back and looked at her and said, "You look well." "I am well," Ida said. Her mother looked at Cornelius, who was standing a respectful step behind Ida with Edmund in his arms. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly and without softening. "You are the husband," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Cornelius said. She studied him for a moment. "You are holding that baby like you know how to." "I have had some practice," he said. She looked at the baby, who was looking back at her with the wide, unfocused attention of a baby encountering a new face. Then she looked at Cornelius again. Then she looked at Ida. "All right," she said, which from her mother was approximately equivalent to a declaration of approval. She stayed for 3 weeks, and she was difficult in the particular ways Ida had always known, and she was also genuinely wonderful with the children. And she helped Ida preserve the early summer vegetables, and she sat on the porch in the evenings with Cornelius and argued with him about the proper management of root crops, which Cornelius bore with good grace, and which Ida's mother seemed to genuinely enjoy. Before she left, she took Ida aside and said, "He is a good man," and Ida said, "Yes." And her mother looked at her for a moment and said, "I wish I had come sooner. I wish I had come when you needed me." And Ida said, "You are here now," which was the true and full answer. By the autumn of 1884, Ida and Cornelius had been married for nearly 2 years, and the homestead had grown to include a proper barn and a second corral and 4 more acres of ground that Cornelius had quietly filed a second claim on, expanding what they held. The garden was productive. The chickens were numerous. Hattie had produced a foal in May, a gray-brown colt that Samuel had immediately named Thunder, this time without objection from anyone. Dolly was 10 now and was writing letters. She had been corresponding with the schoolteacher in Ashland, a young woman named Miss Kavanaugh who had come out from Missouri, and Miss Kavanaugh had written to Ida to say that Dolly had an exceptional mind, and that if she wished to continue her education, the school could offer more than its basic curriculum. Ida and Cornelius had talked about this for a long evening and decided together that Dolly would board in Ashland 3 nights a week during the school term to take the advanced lessons. And Dolly had received this news with the same careful, contained reaction she brought to things she very much wanted, which was to say she went very still and then said, very quietly, "All right. Thank you," and did not say anything else for the rest of the evening, but could be heard much later from the loft, apparently reciting mathematical principles to herself. The evenings had taken on the texture of lives well made. Supper on the table in the light of the lamp, the children with their various projects, the sound of the fire, the sound of the planes outside the walls. Cornelius at the table with his book or his correspondence or his leather working, which he had taken up in the winter months as something to do with his hands. Ida with her sewing or her accounts or her letter writing. One October evening, Edmund on her lap pulling at her hair with great concentration, Cornelius looked up from across the table and said, "Are you happy?" It was not the question a person asked when they suspected the answer was no. It was the question a person asked when they knew the answer was yes but wanted to hear it. "Very," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that full, open expression she had come to know completely over the years, the expression that meant he was saying everything. "Good," he said, and went back to his book. She looked at the lamp's light on the table, and at Edmund's small concentrated face, and at the children on the other side of the room, and at her husband's bent head, and at the walls of the cabin she had built and the room he had added and the barn he had raised and the life they had made together from 2 people who had been, in different ways and for different reasons, living very carefully and without much hope, and she thought about what it meant to have a place in the world, a real one. Built rather than inherited or assigned or settled for. She thought about the knock at the door. 3 even, careful knocks, the kind a person made when they were not entirely sure they were welcome. She was very glad she had opened it. The winter of 1884 moved in over the plains in the particular way Kansas winters did, not gradually but all at once, a definitive shift from autumn to something harder and more serious, and they were ready for it. The cellar, which had once held frightened children and which was now full of preserved vegetables and dried beans, and the apples that Cornelius had brought back from a town 2 days' ride away because he had heard they were good for keeping, was stocked and sufficient. The woodpile was massive. The cabin was tight. On the first real snow day of that winter, when the plains outside had gone entirely white and the world had narrowed to the warm circle of the cabin interior, the 5 of them spent the day inside together. Dolly and Samuel played a card game that devolved into a minor argument and then resolved itself. Edmund sat in the middle of the floor and explored the wooden blocks that had been Samuel's and were now his. Ida made bread and a soup that filled the cabin with warmth and the smell of good things. Cornelius read aloud for a while from the geography book, not to anyone in particular and to everyone simultaneously, describing the landscape of the Rocky Mountain territories in a voice that made it sound like something worth traveling toward. In the late afternoon, Samuel fell asleep on the rug in front of the stove, and Dolly went up to the loft with her book, and Edmund went asleep in his cradle, and Ida and Cornelius sat alone by the fire for the first time in what felt like days, which it might have been. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask me anything," he said, the same answer he always gave. "Are you glad you stopped that evening, with the horse?" He looked at the fire. She could see him actually thinking about it, actually going back to that evening, considering it from the outside. "I almost did not stop," he said. "I saw the light and thought about it for a good long while and almost rode on. I did not want to frighten anyone. I knew what it looked like, a man riding up alone to a woman's homestead at dark." "What made you stop?" He was quiet for a moment. "Hattie," he said. "Honestly, she was going lame and I was worried about her." The practical need overrode the hesitation. "So we have Hattie to thank," Ida said. "I have been grateful to that horse every day since," he said, and turned to look at her with the full warmth that she still was not entirely used to, that still sometimes caught her off guard, that she hoped would always catch her off guard because the day it stopped feeling like something particular would be a day she did not want to reach. "Come spring," he said, "I want to put in a new fence line on the east boundary, and I want to talk to Garfield about leasing some of his northern pasture." And she said, because she could hear an end in his voice, he looked at her, "And I want another child." She looked back at him. Edmund was 9 months old, and she was not particularly tired in the way she had been in the early months, and she had been thinking, lately and without quite meaning to, about the east-facing room and what it might look like with 2 small beds instead of 1. "Ask me in the spring," she said, "when the fence is done." He laughed, and it was that full, unguarded laugh, and she leaned against him on the bench by the fire, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the winter warmth, while the snow fell outside against the walls of the home they had made, and the fire talked to itself, and their children slept, and the great Kansas plains lay white and silent and enormous all around them. This was what she had come out here for, she thought. Not this specifically, not this man and these children and this particular constellation of warmth and ordinary happiness. She had not known enough to want this specifically. She had come out here to be free, which was the only thing she had known she needed, and freedom had turned out to be a larger country than she had imagined, large enough to include this. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind outside the walls and the fire inside them and the breathing of her husband beside her, steady and real, and she thought about 3 knocks on a door at dusk, and a voice that said, "I am not the man she was hiding from," and an open door, and everything that had been waiting on the other side of it. In the spring, as promised, the fence went up and the Garfield pasture lease was signed. And on a warm May evening, with the last of the sunset going gold over the western plains and Edmund toddling in the yard with Samuel watching over him and Dolly sitting on the fence reading her book, Cornelius came to stand beside Ida at the garden gate, and she looked at the evening, and at her life arranged before her in the warm light, and said, without waiting to be asked, "Yes." He looked at her. "I know I told you to ask me in the spring," she said. "I am answering in advance." He smiled, the full, open smile that still changed his face entirely. "Yes," he said back, because that was the answer to everything between them and had been since the beginning. The second boy came the following winter, February of 1886, smaller than Edmund had been and quieter from the very start, with pale gray eyes that were unmistakably Ida's and a patient watchfulness about him that she recognized and loved. They named him Thomas. Samuel, who was now 8 and very serious about his position as eldest brother, immediately appointed himself Thomas's primary guardian, a role he discharged with such focused dedication that Cornelius told Ida privately that he was not certain Samuel fully understood that Thomas was a baby and not a project. And Ida said that she thought Samuel understood exactly, and just felt the same about babies as he did about bean plants, which was that they required careful tending and clear accountability, and Cornelius said that was probably accurate. Dolly, at 12, was the kind of child that teachers talked about in terms that were part admiration and part awed bewilderment. She had been corresponding with a woman named Dr. Eliza Bright in Kansas City, who had written a column in a newspaper about the education of girls on the frontier, and Miss Kavanaugh in Ashland had been the one to facilitate the introduction. And Dolly had been exchanging letters for 6 months now on the subjects of mathematics and land management, and whatever else she felt like discussing. And Dr. Bright had written to Ida to say that her daughter's mind was remarkable. Ida had read that letter 3 times. Cornelius had read it 4. By the summer of 1886, the homestead was something different from what Ida had built alone in that first desperate winter. It was still essentially hers, still the place she had claimed and named and built, but it was fuller now, richer in the particular way that lives became richer when they were shared with the right people. The barn held 6 horses now, including Thunder, who had grown into a handsome and opinionated animal that was Sam's particular responsibility. The garden stretched across the north side of the property in long, productive rows. The cabin with its additions was warm and full, and always somewhat cluttered in the way of houses where children were actually living. On a summer evening when Edmund was 2 and Thomas was 6 months old, and Samuel and Dolly were having a philosophical debate in the yard about whether you could really own a piece of land or whether you were just borrowing it from the sky, Cornelius came to sit beside Ida on the porch steps, and she handed him a cup of coffee. Still the same good Kansas City ground coffee that was now a fixed and regular part of their stores. And they sat together and listened to the children arguing. And the plains were gold in the evening light, and the sky was enormous and clear. And it was possible, sitting there in that moment, to feel the full weight and warmth of having arrived somewhere. "You know what I think about sometimes," Ida said. "What?" he said. "That you almost rode past." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I think about it too. And then Hattie went lame." "And then Hattie went lame," he agreed. They looked at the horse in question, who was standing at the fence with her daughter Thunder and looking out at the evening plains with the serene and proprietorial air of an animal who was entirely comfortable with her situation. "She deserves extra oats," Ida said. "She has been getting extra oats for 3 years," Cornelius said. "She knows why." Ida laughed and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and she felt the solid, warm, familiar weight of it, the way she had felt it 1,000 times and still felt it distinctly, the way the good thing stayed particular. Dolly called out something about property rights, and Cornelius called back a response about John Locke that surprised Dolly into a moment of silence before she rallied with a counterargument. And Samuel said something that neither of them could hear, but that made Dolly say, "That is not how philosophy works." And Thomas made a sound from inside the cabin that was not quite a cry, more of an announcement. And Ida got up to go to him and paused at the door and looked back at her husband on the porch steps in the summer evening light. He looked back at her. "I love you," she said, because it was true, and because she had learned to say true things plainly. "I love you," he said back, plainly and without decoration. She went inside to their son. Outside, the plains went on in every direction, vast and open, and full of everything that could be made of a life when a person was finally, truly free to make it. And the evening settled over the homestead on the Kansas plains, and the light held as long as it could before it gave way to a sky full of stars, and everything was well, and whole, and finished, and good.